The evening sky was painted with shades of orange and purple as the sun slowly dipped behind the crowded buildings. The narrow streets were filled with the usual noises of vendors calling out to sell their last items for the day, children running around barefoot, and the occasional honking of rickshaws trying to pass through the tight lanes. In the middle of all this, a young woman walked quietly, carrying a small cloth bag filled with vegetables she had managed to buy at a discounted price. Life had never been easy for her, but she had grown used to these little struggles, finding comfort in small victories like bargaining for food or saving a few coins for the week ahead. Her home was not far, a small room at the corner of an old building that looked like it could collapse any day. Still, it was a roof over her head, and she was grateful for that. As she made her way through the street, she passed by a dark alley that she usually avoided. But on this evening, something unusual caught her attention. At first, she thought it was just the sound of a stray cat, but when she paused and listened more carefully, she realized it was something different. A faint, desperate cry reached her ears. It was not the cry of an animal. It was the cry of a baby. She stopped in her tracks, her heart beating faster. She looked around to see if anyone else had heard it, but the crowd walked by without noticing. Some people were too busy, some too tired, and some simply didn't care. But she couldn't ignore it. The sound tugged at her heart, pulling her towards the alley. Slowly, she stepped inside, her slippers brushing against the dirt and broken bottles that littered the ground. The cries grew clearer, weak yet persistent, guiding her further in. Finally, near a pile of old trash bags and torn cardboard boxes, she saw a small bundle wrapped in dirty cloth. Her hands trembled as she bent down. When she pulled the cloth aside, her breath caught in her throat. A tiny face peeked out, red and fragile, with tears rolling down its cheeks. It was a newborn baby. For a moment she froze, unable to believe what she was seeing. Who would leave a baby here in the filth among the flies and garbage? She felt her chest tighten with anger and sorrow. The baby's little fists moved weakly, its cries fading as though it had been crying for hours and was running out of strength. Without thinking twice, she scooped the baby up into her arms. The warmth of the child's body against her chest made her heart ache. She cradled the baby close, whispering softly as if her words could comfort it. The baby stirred, letting out another cry, but this time it sounded less desperate. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at the innocent life in her arms. The world outside had forgotten this child, but she would not. She hurried out of the alley, clutching the baby tightly. People on the street stopped and stared, some whispering, some shocked, others curious. An old woman asked what had happened, and she quickly explained that she had found the baby abandoned in the trash. A few people gasped, covering their mouths in disbelief. Some shook their heads, muttering about the cruelty of the world. But none of them stepped forward to take responsibility. It was only her, a young woman with nothing to her name, holding the most fragile life she had ever touched. She didn't know what to do, but she knew the baby needed help fast. She rushed towards the nearest small clinic. The doctor, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, looked at her with surprise when she placed the baby on the examination table. He quickly checked the baby's heartbeat, breathing, and tiny limbs. Relief washed over her when he said the child was weak but alive. The doctor asked where she had found the baby, and she told him the whole story, her voice shaking as she recounted the cries, the alley, and the dirty cloth. The doctor nodded gravely and called a nurse to clean and wrap the baby properly. As she watched the nurse gently handle the child, her heart still raced. She couldn't shake off the image of the baby lying helplessly in the trash. She wondered what kind of pain or desperation had led someone to abandon such a tiny soul in such a cruel way. She also wondered why fate had chosen her to be the one to find it. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. By the next morning, the story was already being talked about in tea shops, markets, and even local newspapers. A headline read, "Young Woman Rescues Baby from Trash." The paper carried a picture of her standing outside the clinic, holding the baby wrapped in a clean blanket. She didn't seek attention, but suddenly everyone seemed to know her name. People she had never spoken to before came up to her, praising her courage and kindness. For a moment, she felt like she was living someone else's life. She had never been in the spotlight, never been called a hero. Yet now, strangers looked at her with admiration. Despite the attention, her heart was focused only on the child. Every time she thought of that night, she felt the same chill run down her spine. If she had walked a little faster, if she had ignored the sound like everyone else, the baby might not have survived. The thought made her shiver. She didn't see herself as special. She just couldn't ignore a cry for help. But as the days passed, something unexpected began to grow inside her. Every time she visited the clinic to check on the baby, she felt an unexplainable pull. She would sit beside the crib, watching the child's tiny chest rise and fall, and she couldn't stop herself from smiling. Sometimes she talked softly to the baby, telling stories about the world outside, about the sky and the sun and the street full of noise and colors. She knew the baby couldn't understand her words, but she felt a strange peace whenever she spoke. It was not just sympathy. It was something deeper, something she didn't have words for, a connection. As if she and this baby were linked by fate in some hidden way. She tried to brush the feeling aside, telling herself it was only because she had been the one to find the baby. But in her heart, she knew it was more than that. Life continued in its usual struggles, but now her thoughts were always with the baby. At night, when she lay in her tiny room listening to the noise of the city, she often closed her eyes and pictured the little face she had found in the alley. She remembered the fragile cry, the desperate fists, and the way the baby had calmed in her arms. It was a memory that stayed with her, haunting and comforting at the same time. She had no idea that this single moment, this one decision to follow a faint cry, had already set her life on a path she could never have imagined. She didn't know that saving the baby would not only change the child's destiny, but also reveal the hidden truth of her own past. For now, all she knew was that she had held a life that was almost lost, and that her heart had been changed forever. The baby's rescue had already become the most talked about story in the neighborhood. Everyone wanted to know who the young woman was, how she had found the child, and why she had been the only one to step forward when so many had passed by. The local paper had written about it, and by the following day a small news channel arrived to interview her. She had never stood in front of a camera before, and when the microphone was held near her face, her voice trembled. She only said the truth. She had heard the baby's cries, and she could not ignore them. Nothing more, nothing less. To her it was simple. But to the world watching, her actions were extraordinary. The video spread quickly. Within hours, people were sharing it online, praising her bravery and kindness. Strangers commented that she had a golden heart, that she was proof goodness still existed in the world. Some even began calling her the guardian of the abandoned child. It all felt unreal to her. She was used to blending into the background, to living quietly, unnoticed. Suddenly she was everywhere. Children in the street would point at her and whisper, "That's her." Shopkeepers smiled more warmly when she walked by. Even the landlord, who rarely spoke politely to her, greeted her with respect. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. But behind all the attention, her own thoughts were with the baby. The hospital had taken the child under its care, and she visited every day. The nurses welcomed her kindly, allowing her to sit beside the little crib. Each time she walked into the room, the baby's tiny eyes seemed to search for her. She couldn't explain it, but she felt as if the child recognized her voice, as if the soft hums and whispers she offered brought comfort. Sometimes she stayed for hours watching the baby sleep, listening to the steady rhythm of its breathing. In those moments, the world outside faded away. There was only her and the little life she had saved. One afternoon, while she sat in the hospital room, a group of reporters arrived. They asked the doctor questions about the baby's health, about the condition it was found in, and about the young woman who had brought it in. She sat quietly, trying not to draw attention, but soon one of them turned to her.
"Can you tell us what you felt when you first saw the child?"
The reporter asked. She hesitated, then answered softly, "I felt that no one should be left like that, especially not a baby. I only thought of saving it." Her words were simple, yet they touched everyone who heard them. That night, her interview played on television, and once again her face appeared on screens across the city. The attention brought both kindness and curiosity. Some people came forward offering donations of milk, clothes, and blankets for the baby. Others began asking questions about her own life. Where had she come from? Did she have a family? Did she have children of her own? She avoided most of these questions, feeling uncomfortable under such scrutiny. She didn't have exciting answers. She had grown up in an orphanage, moved from one foster home to another, and eventually built her own life through hard work. She had no parents to speak of, no siblings she knew of, no one waiting for her at home. It was just her. Still, the curiosity grew. A few journalists started digging into her past, looking for details to add to their stories. One of them visited the orphanage where she had once lived. The caretaker remembered her well and described her as quiet, helpful, and strong-willed. She always cared for the younger children, the caretaker said. Even when she had nothing herself, she would share whatever she had. The words added another layer to her story, painting her as someone who had always carried kindness within her. But there was one detail that caught attention more than anything else. She had no record of parents or relatives. She had been found as a toddler, wandering alone near a bus station. No one had ever come forward to claim her. At the time, it was believed she had been abandoned. But now, with the spotlight on her, whispers began to spread. Could there be more to her story? Was there something hidden in her past? She knew nothing of these whispers. All she knew was the feeling she couldn't shake whenever she held the baby. It was as if something deep inside her stirred, something she didn't understand. One evening, as she sat by the crib, she whispered, "Why do I feel like you're part of me?" She brushed her hand gently across the baby's tiny fingers, and for a moment it was as if the world stood still. Outside the hospital walls, her story continued to spread. A larger news channel picked it up, and soon people from different cities were talking about her. Some praised her courage, while others grew curious about the mystery of her past. A journalist began comparing her childhood photo from the orphanage with old missing persons records. It was a simple act of curiosity, but it led to a surprising discovery. There was a striking resemblance between her and a child who had disappeared many years ago, the daughter of a wealthy business tycoon. The child had been kidnapped as a toddler and never found, leaving the family devastated. Could it be possible that this young woman who had just saved a baby was that missing daughter? At first it was only speculation, but it quickly grew into a story. Reporters asked her questions directly, but she shook her head in disbelief. She couldn't imagine herself as the child of a wealthy family. She had lived her entire life struggling to survive, counting every coin. How could she belong to a world of luxury and power? It seemed impossible. Yet the whispers did not stop. Meanwhile, her bond with the baby deepened. Every visit made her heart ache with a strange mix of joy and sadness. She knew the baby would likely be placed in an orphanage or adopted by another family. The thought pained her, but she told herself that at least the child would live, at least it would have a chance at life. She prayed silently for the baby's future, wishing it would never feel the kind of loneliness she had endured growing up. Then one day, as she entered the hospital, she noticed unusual activity. Journalists crowded the entrance, cameras flashing, microphones raised. She tried to walk past quietly, but someone called out her name, asking if she had heard the latest news. Confused, she shook her head and hurried inside. When she reached the baby's room, the nurse told her in a hushed voice that officials had arrived. They wanted to take the baby for further protection and investigation, as it was now considered a case of abandonment. Her heart sank. She didn't want to let go, but she had no power to stop them. She watched helplessly as the baby was carried away in careful arms. She wanted to cry out, to beg them not to take the child, but her voice wouldn't come. The room felt empty without the sound of soft cries. Her chest felt hollow, as though something precious had been ripped away. That night, she couldn't sleep. The image of the baby being taken away replayed again and again in her mind. For the first time, she felt completely lost. She had saved the child, yet now it was gone from her life. She wondered if she would ever see it again. She didn't know that this loss was only the beginning, and that the events unfolding would soon circle back to her in ways she could never imagine. In the days that followed, she tried to return to her usual life, but nothing felt the same. The street seemed emptier, her small room colder. She carried on with her chores, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Each time she closed her eyes, she heard the faint cry that had led her into the alley. She could not forget. She did not want to forget. And while she lived with this quiet ache, the outside world continued to talk about her. The story of the young woman and the baby had grown far beyond her neighborhood. It was no longer just a tale of kindness. It was now a mystery, a puzzle of identity and fate that people wanted to solve. Unknown to her, powerful eyes had already turned towards her, watching, wondering if she was more than what she believed herself to be. The days that followed felt heavier than the young woman could have ever imagined. The baby was no longer in her arms, and the silence of her small room grew louder each night. She still walked past the alley where she had first heard the faint cries, and every time she did, her chest tightened. The world outside seemed to keep moving, but inside her heart everything felt paused. Yet life had a way of pushing forward, and she tried to keep herself busy, though her thoughts returned again and again to the child she had rescued. Meanwhile, outside her knowledge, more people were trying to connect the pieces of her past. The simple story of a girl saving a baby had taken on another layer. Journalists continued to dig deeper, and whispers about her possible link to a wealthy family grew louder. People compared old photographs, studied missing persons reports, and interviewed anyone who might know something about her early years. Slowly, a picture began to form, one that suggested she was not who she believed herself to be. One afternoon, as she worked in a small tailoring shop where she stitched clothes for a few coins, a man walked in with a folder under his arm. He didn't look like a customer. He introduced himself as a reporter and politely asked if he could speak with her. She was reluctant, but he insisted gently, promising it wouldn't take long. They sat in a corner of the shop, and he began asking about her childhood. She explained again what little she knew. She had grown up in an orphanage with no memory of her parents. She had been told she was found wandering alone near a bus station when she was very small. Beyond that, her life had been a blur of foster homes, schools, and work. The reporter listened carefully, then slid a photograph across the table. It was an old picture of a little girl, dressed in expensive clothes, smiling at the camera. "Do you see the resemblance?" he asked. She looked at the photo, confused. The child in the picture had brighter eyes and cleaner clothes than she remembered ever having, but the shape of the face, the curve of the smile, it looked familiar. Too familiar. Her hands trembled slightly as she pushed the photo back. "It's not me," she said quickly, trying to avoid his gaze. But deep down something stirred. She didn't want to believe it. Yet part of her couldn't ignore the feeling. The reporter left, but the photograph stayed in her mind. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of her room, wondering about the little girl in the picture. Could it be possible that she was someone else before the orphanage? Could she have belonged to a family that was still out there searching? She shook her head, scolding herself for entertaining such thoughts. People like her did not belong to wealthy families. She was just an ordinary woman who had struggled all her life, yet the doubt had already been planted and it refused to leave. The next few days were filled with questions. More reporters came, each carrying similar photographs and documents. One even mentioned the name of a tycoon whose daughter had been kidnapped many years ago. The child had vanished without a trace, and despite endless searches, no one had ever found her. The family had been heartbroken, but with time the world had moved on. Until now. Now, with her face appearing on television and newspapers, comparisons were being drawn. The missing child and the young woman looked strikingly alike. At first, she dismissed it all. She told herself it was just coincidence, just imagination. But as she visited the clinic again, hoping to get news about the baby, she overheard two nurses whispering. "Do you think it's true?" one asked. "What if she really is the tycoon's daughter?" the other replied. They both looked at her when they noticed she was near, their eyes filled with curiosity and a hint of awe. Her cheeks burned as she walked past them quickly, pretending not to hear. But the words stayed with her. She felt torn. On one hand, she wanted to ignore everything and return to her simple life. On the other, she couldn't help but wonder if the whispers carried some truth. She remembered the countless times as a child, when she had asked about her parents and received only silence or vague answers. What if there was a reason no one had ever come for her? What if she hadn't been abandoned but taken from somewhere she truly belonged? The turning point came when officials contacted her directly. One evening, as she returned from work, two well-dressed men stood outside her building. They introduced themselves as investigators working with the authorities. They explained that due to the growing media attention, they needed to confirm whether the rumors about her past were true. They requested her cooperation in taking a DNA test. The mention of such a test made her freeze. She had heard about it, but never imagined it would one day be connected to her own life. Her voice shook as she asked, "What if I don't want to know?" One of the men replied gently, "Sometimes the truth finds us even when we don't search for it." That night she sat alone in her room, staring at her reflection in a small broken mirror. She traced her features with her eyes, wondering if they belonged to someone else, someone she had never known. Tears welled up as she whispered to herself, "Who am I?" She thought of the baby she had saved, and suddenly, a strange thought crossed her mind. Maybe rescuing that child had been the key to unlocking her own forgotten story. The next morning, she agreed to the test. The process was quick, just a small swab and some paperwork. The officials assured her the results would take some time. She nodded silently, her heart heavy with uncertainty. Each day afterward felt endless. Every sound of footsteps outside her door, every knock made her pulse race. She wondered if the results had come, if her life was about to change forever. While she waited, the baby remained in her thoughts. She visited whenever she could, though it was harder now with the officials involved. Each time she held the child, she felt both comfort and fear. Comfort, because the baby reminded her of the pure bond she had discovered. Fear, because she worried the baby might be taken far away and she might never see it again. In some unexplainable way, she felt her fate was tied to that child. Meanwhile, news continued to spread. Television debates began, with experts discussing whether the young woman was truly the missing daughter. Some argued the resemblance was undeniable, while others cautioned against jumping to conclusions without proof. The Tycoon's family, who had lived in grief for years, remained silent, but inside their mansion hope flickered again. Could their lost daughter have been living all this time in hardship, only to return through an act of kindness? The city buzzed with curiosity. People who had once ignored her now looked at her with wide eyes, whispering as she passed. Some treated her with sudden respect, others with envy, and a few with disbelief. She felt overwhelmed, caught in a storm she hadn't chosen. She had only wanted to save a child. She had never asked for fame, never sought attention. Now her very identity was being questioned in front of the world. Days turned into weeks and the waiting gnawed at her. She tried to keep working, but her hands often shook, making her stitches uneven. She tried to sleep, but dreams haunted her. Dreams of a little girl in fine clothes reaching out for her but fading into the dark. Sometimes she dreamed of the baby crying in the alley, only for the cry to turn into her own voice calling out for someone to find her. She would wake up in tears, her pillow damp. At last, the day came. The officials returned, their expressions serious. She sat in silence, her heart pounding so loudly she thought they could hear it. One of them placed an envelope on the table. "The results are here," he said. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, but she couldn't bring herself to open it. Instead, she looked at him, her eyes pleading. He nodded and said softly, "It's true. You are their daughter." The words hit her like a storm. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she thought she had misheard, but as the truth sank in, tears filled her eyes. All the years of loneliness, all the questions about why no one had come for her, suddenly had an answer. She had not been abandoned. She had been lost. And now she was found. She didn't know what to feel. Joy, sorrow, confusion all swirled inside her. She thought of the Tycoon's family, the parents who had spent years mourning her. She thought of her childhood in the orphanage, the struggles, the hunger, the longing. She thought of the baby she had saved, the child who had unknowingly led her to this discovery. Nothing made sense, yet everything connected. That night she sat quietly by her window, looking at the stars. Her tears fell freely as she whispered, "So this is who I am." But even as she tried to absorb the truth, she knew her journey was far from over. She had been found, yes, but what awaited her now? Would the wealthy family accept her after so many years? Would she be able to leave behind the life she had known? And what about the baby, the fragile little life that had changed everything? As the city slept, she felt the weight of destiny pressing upon her shoulders. She had walked into an alley one evening and come out carrying not just a baby, but the key to her own hidden past. The story was no longer just about saving a child. It was about finding herself. And deep down she knew that the days ahead would shape her in ways she had never imagined. The news of the DNA results spread quickly, reaching every corner of the city and beyond. By the next morning, newspapers carried bold headlines, "Missing heiress found after years of disappearance." Her picture, the same one that had once shown her as the girl who saved a baby, was now displayed beside an old photograph of the little child who had been kidnapped decades ago. The resemblance was striking, and now the test had confirmed it. The girl who had lived in silence, blending into the crowd, was suddenly the center of one of the greatest mysteries solved in years. She sat quietly in her small room, staring at the walls that had sheltered her through hardship. Everything looked the same, the cracked paint, the broken chair, the worn-out bed. Yet everything had changed. She was no longer just the girl who stitched clothes to survive. She was the missing daughter of a tycoon. The thought felt too big for her to carry. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if holding her own body would keep her grounded. The officials returned to her again, this time with representatives from the Tycoon's family. They spoke kindly, but she could see the weight of years in their eyes. They told her that her parents had never stopped searching, never stopped hoping. They had poured resources, time, and endless prayers into finding her, but the trail had always gone cold. Until now. Now she was here, alive, though scarred by a life they had not been there to protect her from. When they asked her to meet her parents, she hesitated. Her mind swirled with questions. Would they accept her as she was? Would they be disappointed to see the life she had lived? Would they regret knowing the truth after all these years? But another part of her longed to see them, to feel the embrace she had never known, to belong somewhere beyond the walls of an orphanage. Finally, with a trembling voice, she agreed. The meeting was arranged in a grand house far from the narrow street she knew. She had never seen such tall gates or wide gardens. As the car pulled in, her heart pounded so hard she thought she would faint. She clutched the edge of her seat, staring at the mansion that seemed like something from a dream. When the car stopped, her legs felt heavy, but she forced herself to step out. Every step towards the entrance felt like walking into another world. Inside, the house was filled with silence. A few family members stood in the hall, their eyes fixed on her, but her gaze went straight to the two people standing at the center. An older man with silver hair and sharp features, and a woman with kind eyes but a face marked by years of sorrow. They both looked at her as if they were seeing a ghost. She froze, unsure what to do. Then the woman suddenly rushed forward, tears streaming down her cheeks. She cupped the young woman's face in her hands, whispering, "My child, my child." The man's eyes watered, and though he tried to remain composed, his voice broke as he said, "You're finally home." The young woman couldn't hold back anymore. Her tears fell freely as she let herself be embraced. For the first time in her life, she felt what it meant to belong to someone, to be claimed with love. The warmth of their arms melted the years of loneliness she had carried. She cried not just for herself, but for the years lost, the childhood stolen, the memories they never shared. It was a moment of pain and healing all at once. The days that followed were overwhelming. News channels ran endless coverage of the reunion. People across the country celebrated the miracle of her return. Some saw it as fate, others as destiny. Gifts and letters poured in from strangers who felt inspired by her story. The Tycoon's family tried their best to shield her from the noise, but the world seemed unwilling to look away. Inside the mansion, her life shifted in ways she had never imagined. She now had a room bigger than the entire space she had once called home. The walls were painted fresh, the bed soft and wide, the curtains flowing like silk. Servants offered her food she had never tasted before, clothes she had never dared to dream of wearing. Everyone treated her with respect, calling her by her rightful name. The name she had never known belonged to her. Yet despite the luxury, she often found herself sitting by the window, looking out at the city lights, longing for the simplicity of her old room. She missed the rough walls, the sound of street vendors outside, even the hum of the sewing machine at the tailoring shop. She felt like a guest in her own life, as if she had stepped into a story meant for someone else. Sometimes she asked herself if she truly belonged here, or if fate had played a cruel trick by throwing her between two worlds. Her parents noticed her unease. They tried to comfort her, telling her that she had all the time she needed to adjust, that she didn't need to change who she was, but she struggled to believe it. The gap between her old life and this new one felt too wide to bridge. At meals, she sometimes forgot which spoon to use. In conversations, she often stayed silent, unsure how to fit into the flow. Her parents reassured her again and again, but the doubts remained in her heart. Amid all this, one thought never left her: the baby. The child she had saved was the reason she was standing here now. She wanted to know what had happened, where the baby had been taken, and who would care for it. When she asked her parents about it, they promised to make inquiries. For her, the baby was more than just a rescued life. It was a symbol of the connection between her past and her future, the fragile cry that had led her to her own truth. Days turned into weeks, and she began to slowly adjust. She learned to walk the halls of the mansion without feeling lost. She spent time with her parents, listening to stories about the years they had missed, the endless search, the hope they had clung to. She discovered little details about herself that amazed her. Her mother's smile mirrored her own. Her father's determination lived in her spirit. For the first time, she understood where she came from, but the outside world did not let her rest. Reporters continued to follow her, asking how she felt, what her plans were, and what she would do now. Some people admired her, while others gossiped, questioning whether she deserved her place in the wealthy family after growing up in poverty. Rumors spread that she might not be able to handle the responsibilities that came with her name. She ignored most of it, but the whispers stung. She didn't want to be seen as an outsider in her own family's story. Her parents stood firmly by her side, reminding her that she was their daughter no matter what. They began involving her in family matters, introducing her to relatives and business associates. Each introduction was overwhelming, but she faced it bravely, remembering the strength she had built during years of hardship. Slowly, people began to accept her, seeing not just the lost daughter but also the woman who had survived and shown extraordinary courage. One evening, as she sat in the garden of the mansion, her mother joined her. The older woman held her hand and said softly, "Do you know why I never lost hope? Because I felt in my heart that you were alive. I prayed every day that you were safe. And when I saw you on the news holding that baby, I knew immediately. I saw my child in you." The young woman's eyes filled with tears. She whispered, "It was the baby who saved me too. If I hadn't heard those cries, I might never have known who I really am." The baby remained in her thoughts, and eventually, news came that authorities were still searching for information about its parents. No one had come forward, and it seemed likely the child would grow up in an orphanage if not adopted. The young woman's heart ached at the thought. She knew what it felt like to grow up without parents, to long for a family that never came. She didn't want that fate for the baby. Quietly, she told her parents that she wished to care for the child herself. They were surprised, but they saw the determination in her eyes and promised to support her. This decision gave her life new meaning. It was no longer just about adjusting to her identity as the lost daughter of a tycoon. It was about being there for another life, the way she had always wished someone had been there for her. She realized that true wealth was not in the walls of the mansion or the riches of her family, but in the love and care she could give. Her journey had brought her from the dark alley of abandonment to the grand halls of her birthright. But it was the baby who had shown her the path, and so, as she prepared for the next chapter, she knew her story was not about riches or titles. It was about saving and being saved, about finding love in the most unexpected places. She had been lost, but she was found. She had been forgotten, but now she belonged. And with the baby's tiny hand curled in hers, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The young woman's life took another turn as she began the process of caring for the baby. The authorities had given her temporary guardianship while they continued their search for the child's real parents. But weeks had passed and no one had stepped forward. Each day she spent with the baby strengthened her bond, and she knew deep in her heart that this little life was meant to stay with her. It was as if fate had brought them together, weaving two broken stories into one. The mansion that once felt too large, too cold, now echoed with the sound of laughter and small cries. Her parents, though still adjusting to the idea, supported her decision wholeheartedly. They watched with pride as she rocked the baby to sleep, as she carefully learned how to hold the tiny body, how to feed, how to soothe. To them, this was proof of her strength, of her ability to love even after everything she had endured. They often told her that the baby had not only been saved but had also saved their daughter, giving her a new sense of purpose. But adjusting was not easy. Nights were long and often restless. Sometimes the baby cried endlessly, and she would pace the room for hours, whispering soft lullabies she remembered from her childhood. There were moments when exhaustion weighed her down and she doubted herself. Could she really raise this child? Could she give the baby the love and stability it deserved? Yet each time she looked into the child's eyes, she found courage. The baby's tiny hands grasping her fingers reminded her of her own journey, how she too had once been small, lost, and helpless. She promised herself she would never let this child feel the loneliness she had known. As the months passed, she grew more comfortable in her new role. She found herself smiling more, laughing more, even dreaming more. She began to plan for the baby's future, thinking of schools, playrooms, and the kind of life she wanted to provide. Her parents noticed the change and encouraged her, offering resources and guidance. They told her she was free to make decisions, that she had the strength to build a life not just for herself, but for the little one in her arms. The media's attention slowly shifted. At first, they had been fascinated by the reunion of the missing heiress with her wealthy family. Then they turned their gaze to her decision to take care of the baby she had rescued. Many praised her for her compassion, calling her a symbol of hope. Others doubted her ability, saying she was too young, too inexperienced. But she paid little attention. She was no longer living for the opinions of strangers. Her focus was on the baby, on the family she was slowly creating around herself. In the quiet moments of the night, she often thought about the strange path that had brought her here. She had been abandoned once, left in a world that did not seem to care. Yet through her struggle, she had found not only her true family but also the chance to give another child what she had once longed for. Life had come full circle. She had been saved by fate, and now she was the one offering salvation. Her parents grew closer to her as they shared this journey. They often came to her room just to watch the baby sleep, their eyes filled with warmth. They confessed to her one evening that they had always dreamed of seeing her as a mother, though they never thought they would live to witness it. "You have given us back our child," her father said, "and now you have given us a grandchild too." Still, challenges continued. Some relatives questioned her choice, saying it was unwise to raise a child without knowing its origin. They worried about what people would say, about how it might affect the family's reputation. But she stood firm. She reminded them gently that love was not about blood, that family was more than just names and titles. Her parents supported her, silencing the doubts of others. They knew their daughter's heart, and they trusted her. One afternoon, she decided to take the baby back to the neighborhood where she had lived before the truth came out. The tailoring shop, the small streets, the familiar faces, everything was still there. People recognized her instantly, amazed to see her transformed but still the same kind-hearted girl they had always known. They crowded around, blessing her, praising her, asking about the baby. She felt a deep sense of gratitude, knowing that despite everything, she still had roots in the place where her story had begun. She showed the baby the streets she had walked, whispering softly, "This is where I came from. This is where I learned to be strong." That visit reminded her of the importance of staying connected to her past. Though her life had changed completely, she didn't want to forget the lessons of her struggles. She wanted the baby to grow up knowing both worlds, the simplicity of life's small joys and the privilege of opportunities they now had. She wanted the child to understand humility, compassion, and resilience. For her, that balance was the true treasure. As time went on, she found herself growing into a new version of herself. No longer the lost girl searching for identity. No longer just the heiress reunited with her family. She was becoming a woman defined by love, by choice, by responsibility. The baby became the center of her story, a living reminder that even from brokenness, beauty could rise. Years later, as she watched the baby grow into a lively child, she often told the story of how they had met. She spoke of the night when the cries from a trash bin had changed everything. She told it not with bitterness but with pride, showing the child that even the darkest beginnings could lead to the brightest paths. And every time the child listened with wide eyes clutching her hand, she felt peace. Her journey from abandonment to belonging, from poverty to wealth, from loneliness to love, was not just her own anymore. It had become a story that inspired others, a tale shared in schools, in homes, in conversations across the country. People spoke of her not because of the riches she had inherited, but because of the courage she had shown, the compassion she had given, and the life she had saved. And so, as she stood one evening in the garden of the mansion, watching the sunset with her parents by her side and the child playing in the grass, she smiled. Everything she had endured had led to this moment. She was no longer lost, no longer hidden. She was where she was meant to be, loved, needed, and complete. From trash to treasure, from tears to triumph, her story had come full circle. And though life would bring new challenges, she knew she was ready. Because she had learned the greatest truth of all. Real treasure is not found in wealth or status, but in love, in family, and in the simple act of saving one another.